The Commonwealth is a voluntary association of 54 independent states, working together towards shared goals of democracy, development, and peace. Member countries span 6 continents and oceans, from Africa to Asia, the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, and the South Pacific. The Commonwealth is seen as a special family, a family of nations.
The Cooperative Republic of Guyana is the 3rd smallest independent state on the mainland of South America. Once called British Guyana, it is the only state of the Commonwealth of Nations on the South American mainland, and only one on that continent where English is an official language. Guyana is also a member of CARICOM, an organization of Caribbean states which houses its headquarters in the capital, Georgetown. The name Guyana is derived from the American Indian word Guyana, which means land of many waters. Historically, the region of Guyana included what is now known as Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, and parts of Venezuela and Brazil. Modern Guyana is bordered to the north by the Atlantic Ocean, to the west by Venezuela, to the east by Suriname, and to the south by Brazil. Comprising 3 main geographical zones, coastal plain, white sand belt, and the interior highlands, Guyana has one of the largest unspoiled rainforests in South America. Indeed, the rich natural history of Guyana has been described since the time of early explorers such as Sir Walter Raleigh and later by naturalists Sir David Attenborough and Gerald Durrell. In 2008, the BBC ran a 3-part series which highlighted the diversity of wildlife and the rare species of Guyana. Home to one of the most powerful waterfalls in the world, Guyana also possesses vast mineral resources such as bauxite, gold, diamond, and uranium. In 1499, the first Europeans arrived in Guyana from Spain, but no Spanish settlement followed. It was the Dutch who first established colonies between 1616 and 1627. The British followed, and in 1814, the Dutch formally ceded Guyana to Britain. In 1831, the 3 Dutch colonies became a single British colony known as British Guiana. It was the only possession that Britain ever held on the mainland of South America.
There were several interchanges and exchanges between the Dutch and the British. The Dutch colonized Guyana during its earliest periods. And so the influence of the Dutch in Guyana is quite extraordinary in terms of our the structure of the economy, the roadways, the buildings, etc. There were some interchanges, as I said, brief interchanges with other European powers, including the French.
Although the British ruled, important elements of the old Dutch constitution remained in effect. Once slavery had been abolished in 1838, the British governed through various institutions which provided some measure of democratic participation.
The early legislature was known as the Court of Policy. It was a legislative structure that was introduced to the colonies by the Dutch, and it continued to be used by the British following their capture of the territory in the early 19th century. It was essentially a legislature that was dominated by planter interests. It was dominated by elite interests. It was dominated by Western European interests, deliberately so, of course, to ensure the hegemony of the planters and the European elite in the colony.
There were periodic clashes between the governor and the planters, and by the late 1880s, the new Afro-Guyanese middle class was clamoring for constitutional reform.
And in 1891, there was a constitutional change that led to the widening of the franchise, that resulted in a change of the complexion of the colony, and particularly the legislature in the colony in the early 20th century.
In the next 3 decades, there were minor political changes. By 1905, the Rumveld riots shook British Guiana when workers took to the streets to show their dissatisfaction with their standard of living. The British sent troops to quell the uprising, and although the strike failed, this paved the way for the development of an organized trade union movement. Labor unrest and violent demonstrations occurred again in the mid-1930s as a result of the Great Depression. The Moyne Commission was established to investigate, and its report in 1938 was a turning point for Guyana. By the end of World War II, increased political awareness led to the development of Guyana's major political parties.
There was a discussion group that was formed in 1946 that was referred to as the Political Affairs Committee, the PAC. It was formed by Dr. Chetty Jagan and his wife Janet Jagan, Ashton Chase, and Jocelyn Hubbard. And it was a group that was designed to really examine the condition of the colony from a nationalist perspective. And on that basis, following a 4-year activism of this political grouping, they formed the People's Progressive Party, the PPP, in 1950. Joining them was a barrister who had just returned from England, Forbes Burnham, who had great appeal to the urban African masses. And as a consequence, the PPP was formed, became the first mass-based political party in the colony.
In October 1948, the Waddington Commission was appointed. The result was the 1951 Waddington Constitution, which provided for universal adult suffrage and the adoption of a ministerial system. General elections were held in 1953, and the PPP won 18 of the 34 seats in the lower chamber of the legislature. Provoked by the PPP's introduction of the Labour Relations Act, Britain suspended the colony's constitution, sent in troops, and appointed an interim government which lasted until 1957.
We were a victim of the Cold War, and at that point in time, the Cuban Revolution had just come about in 1959, and I think the powers that be had an attitude, because the world was divided into two poles. There was an attitude that if you're not with me, you're against me, and there was no appreciation of the grey parts. And we became a victim of that, and proportional representation was imposed on us because they saw that that was a way to remove the PPP from government. Actually, throughout the history of the party, constitutional manipulation was constantly used to remove us from power, because the first election we won was in 1953, when nobody expected us to win that election, and we won 18 of the 24 seats. The next election in 1957, after they had suspended the constitution, was to manipulate the constitution and manipulate the boundaries to try to defeat us. When we won again, they manipulated the boundaries even more. And when we won again in 1961, they changed the whole system to proportional representation.
By 1957, internal conflicts arose in the PPP and the party was split.
There was a split in the PPP over a number of issues. One was the leadership question. Both Dr. Jagan and Forbes Burnham had large political ambitions, and both wanted to be leader of that particular political party. It wasn't possible for both to be leader at the same time.
In 1957, out of the split in the PPP, the People's National Congress was formed. This marked the beginning of a long and bitter struggle between the country's two dominant political personalities. In 1957, elections were held under a new constitution which provided limited self-government. The growing ethnic division in the Guyanese electorate was evident, and Jagan's PPP faction won, drawing its support more and more from the Indo-Guyanese community. The PPP could no longer claim to be a multiracial party. The 1961 elections were held under another new constitution. Apart from returning to self-government, it introduced a bicameral system and the post of Prime Minister. The PPP won 20 seats, the PNC 11 seats, and Jagan was appointed Premier. 1961 to 1964 was a period of civil unrest, turmoil and violence in British Guiana. Apart from this, the Jagan administration had become increasingly friendly with communist and leftist regimes, and both the British and Americans felt this posed a threat to democracy in the region. In 1964, in an effort to quell the prolonged turmoil, political parties sought intervention from the British government. The constitution was amended and elections were set. In the 1964 elections, the PPP won 24 seats, the PNC 22, and the UF 7 seats. Backed by the British and Americans, the PNC formed a coalition with the UF to form the government, and Forbes Burnham was installed as Prime Minister. During the first year under Burnham, conditions in Guyana began to stabilize, and by 1966, the country achieved independence. On the achievement of independence, British Guyana adopted the name Guyana, later declared Republican status. In 1978, the National Assembly was dissolved into a Constituent Assembly, and in 1980 the Republican Constitution was established. Burnham became the country's first executive president. In 1985, following Burnham's unexpected death, Prime Minister Desmond Hoyt assumed the presidency and leadership of the PNC. In the December 1985 elections, the PNC won with 79% of the vote. The country then entered a period of economic decline. There were no elections until 1992, after former US President Jimmy Carter visited Guyana to lobby for the resumption of free elections.
1992 is the first free and fair elections after 28 years. Nobody's ever beaten our record of being the only opposition party in the world that was out of government for 28 years and came back with a majority government. 92 to now has been a process of restoring democracy, consolidating democracy, and expanding democracy.
In 1997, President Jagan died of a heart attack.
I believe that President Carter had probably summed it up better than I can, when he said that he was our greatest national asset that we had. Because I think he was our conscience, he was our leader. He found answers in the most difficult moments in our country's history. He always found answer. When he was in the opposition, he not only criticized government's position, but he always proposed alternative ways to go. So and he, of course, his integrity as being very upright and honest, his personal life too, all of these things I think served as a very good example that Guyanese young people can follow. So I would say his contribution was enormous and widespread, morally, politically, intellectually. He was a giant of a man in many ways.
In accordance with constitutional provisions, Jagan was replaced by Prime Minister Samuel Hines. Janet Jagan, his widow, was appointed Prime Minister and then in December 1997 was elected President. Janet Jagan resigned in 1999 due to ill health and was succeeded by Finance Minister Bara Jagdeo. He subsequently won 2 elections in 2001 and 2006 and was the first president of Guyana to demit office due to the term limits of the Constitution. In December 2011, Guyana went to the polls again. The ruling PPPC took 49% of the votes, and the opposition coalition led by David Granger, the APNU, received 41%.
So this is the first time in our political history we've had this coming together of so many parties. And in Parliament at present, there are 5 parties, along with the People's National Congress Reform. There's the Working People's Alliance, the National Front Alliance, the Guyana Action Party, and the Justice for All Party. So these 4 parties had some interaction before 2011 because we had something called the Joint Opposition Political Parties, JOPP, and because the People's Progressive Party has now been in government for nearly 20 years, the parties had started to discuss among themselves how we could create an inclusive front. In fact, our constitution calls for inclusionary democracy. Some people translate that as shared governance.
In 2011, for the first time in 19 years, the PPPC narrowly lost its parliamentary majority to the 2 main opposition parties.
Our National Assembly has, it's unicameral and has 65 seats. Partnership for National Unity won only 26 seats, and the Alliance for Change won 7 seats. That gives us a total of 33. The ruling People's Progressive Party, Civic, has 32 seats. Now, because we did not form a coalition prior to the elections, APNU and the AFC have to negotiate their position. But we've done this quite successfully because the Speaker of the National Assembly is in fact the leader of the Alliance for Change, which has just 7 seats. So he had to be elected with the support of a Partnership for National Unity. So we have common interests because we've all been victims of the People's Progressive Party civic administration, as I said, for nearly 20 years. So we meet quite frequently, certainly every month, to harmonize our position to determine how we will vote when we come into the Parliament, because of course with 1-seat majority you can't have too many mistakes. And we have been working quite well.
We have had a history of multiple opposition parties since 1992, so it's not strange. What's difficult sometimes is getting these two to work together and see themselves as a joint opposition, especially where one has a larger majority over another, and so there's a sense sometimes for one to try to smother the other, whether knowingly or unknowingly or deliberately or otherwise, and for the other to stand as the Alliance for Change with 7 seats to maintain its character, its independence, its principles, whilst working alongside the other opposition party.
And so we have a hybrid Republican Westminster parliamentary democracy. Long title, what it means is that Guyana is a republic with an executive president, but with a parliament that is modeled on a Westminster style.
But the main challenge is as an opposition speaker is working with the government. Of course, there's a lot of suspicion. No government wants a speaker who is not from their party or hasn't come out of their fold or does not enjoy their full confidence. So that's a challenge on both sides. And you see little things happening. It's politics. And so my job, as I said, is to use the standing orders to stand on the side of the rules. We've had a situation where the Attorney General has taken the leader of the opposition and I to court on a constitutional motion. So things have been tense and it's difficult, but I wouldn't say that the challenges are unsurmountable or so difficult that that we got to pack up our tent and go back to elections. I think that we are making progress.
It's a PR system that allows for geographic representation. So when the people go to vote in elections in Guyana, they actually have 3 ballots. The ballots for the national, this is the parties on what's called national top-up for 40 seats in Parliament. And you have the geographic representatives for the 10 regions those are 25 seats that are allocated to Parliament. Depending on your votes at the geographic level, any disproportionality or proportionality is mathematically calculated with the national top-up. So it's quite different than a first-past-the-post system.
Executive authority is exercised by the President, who appoints and supervises the Prime Minister and other ministers. The President is not directly elected. Each party presenting a slate of candidates must designate in advance a leader who will become president if that party receives the largest number of votes.
In our case, the more authority is in the hands of the President than in the hands of the Prime Minister as such. But of course the Prime Minister has a big role to play because it has to deal with constitutional succession and so forth. And in our case, the Prime Minister is not just a titular Prime Minister, but a Prime Minister who has ministerial responsibilities.
Samuel Hines has been Prime Minister of Guyana almost continuously since 1992. He's currently also Minister of Parliamentary Affairs and Energy.
In Guyana, we have an executive president. Mr. Burnham had been Prime Minister for some time, and then in 1980 he made himself president and he took all the prime ministerial powers with him, so that our executive president is head of both head of state and head of government. And in I think our Prime Minister is more in the position of Vice President. He performs the functions of he's a minister first of all, and then he is the minister who is identified to perform the functions of the President if the President is out of the country.
His Excellency Donald Ramutar describes his role as Executive President.
Being head of the government and head of state, of course, all of these responsibilities of both head of government and head of state will fall under me, and although I have ministers in every area, as I said, the buck stops here, so I'm interested in everything that happens in the government. I have regular consultation with the ministers to keep me up to date with what is happening and for my views to be known to them of what I would wish to happen within their sectors from time to time.
Despite the unique challenges, President Ramutar remains focused on fulfilling his administration's mandate.
But I will still say it's a work in progress. I have said, I know that some of them have been offended by what I've said, but I didn't say it to try to attack them. I said because I really believe it. I think that they are intoxicated by the one-seat majority that they have, and I hope that that this intoxication will wear off, and they will realize that we have to work together for the interests of our country.
Cooperative Republic of Guyana, moving ahead as a parliamentary democracy.